Okay, welcome back, everybody. First of all, I'd like to apologize for the abrupt end of our last video, which was our first video on foreign policy during the 1970s, namely the type of foreign policy challenges that seemed to hound President Carter during his presidency. So I kind of ended abruptly because we were kind of going into overtime, and today we're going to finish it with this particular presentation. Not that many slides, but I wouldn't doubt that we hit the 40-minute mark again because there's a whole lot of detail. And as you can tell from the image, that our first slide here, once again, we return to the Middle East as the emerging flashpoint, if you will, uh, when it comes to American foreign policy. And it becomes ever more so in the 70s and even more so in the 80s and in the 90s and so on. So eventually coming to replace the Cold War and the Soviet Union as, the focal point of American foreign policy efforts. So we already had a discussion about the roots of American involvement in the Middle East. Now we're going to come back to the topic. And no country in the Middle East stands out the most during President Carter's presidency as, a place of challenge than the country of Iran, which you see there on the slide. Um, Before we continue any further, and this is important because the United States and Iran still are not on friendly terms. We'll talk a bit about the history there. But if you see Iran, there we know that Iraq is to its west, and Afghanistan and Pakistan is to its east. That body of water to the south of Iran, well, is it the Persian Gulf? Is it the Arabian Gulf? The picture here says the Persian Gulf, but there's also other maps that call it the Arabian Gulf. It's a point of contention between Iran and its neighbors to its west. And then once upon a time, to the north of Iran, you had the Soviet Union. Ethnically, okay, there's a point. Iranians are not Arabs. I know it's very tempting, particularly in the West, to call everybody in the Middle East an Arab and therefore by extension a Muslim. Iranians are not Arabs. Iranians are descendants of ancient Aryan peoples that swept through Central Asia and what is today India and eventually settled in what is today Iran. The original Aryans, if you want to. That's where the word comes from, the actual Aryans, not the nonsense that Hitler said. Um, and that civilization eventually became, we're still talking about the cradle of civilization, right? That became eventually the Persian Empire. So Iranians are Persians. Prior to 1979, it was referred to as Persia, not as Iran. So Iranians are Persians. Iraqis, Saudis, Syrians, you name it, they are Arabs. And Iranians are Shia Muslims. Iraqis are the Shia Muslims to the south, but mostly Sunni Muslims. And as you go in further west, you have more Sunni Muslims are the majority Muslims there. Um, Iran also has a large Kurdish population. All right, so let's get to it. Let's explore what's this beef between Iran and the United States. What happened to it during what role did it play during Carter's presidency, et cetera, et cetera. And if any event in the Middle East having to do with Iran comes to cast a dark shadow over President Carter's presidency, it is the event known of as the Iranian hostage crisis, which in itself stemmed from the Iranian Islamic Revolution of 1979. But why did it have to turn anti? Why did Iran have to turn anti-American? I mean, the people that eventually took over were religious people, were conservative, okay, conservative religious fanatics of the Shia Muslim type. Um, why the antipathy towards the United States? Okay, history. And I remember during World War II, the British and the Soviets convinced Iran to side against the Nazis, depriving the Nazis access to oil. So you had Soviets, occupying the north, you had British occupying the south, and for that to happen, the Shah at the time had to be deposed and replaced by his son, who was more friendly towards the west, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. That is, he took the title as Shah of Iran. Shah in Persian, I guess loosely translates to king. It was a monarchy. After the war, um, there was demands for reform, perhaps a move towards a constitutional monarchy sort of government, since Iran was inching closer and closer to the West after the war. And they had an election, first ever democratically elected president of Iran, Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh. Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, the one thing during his presidency that he noticed was, hey, all this Iranian oil under our feet should belong to Iranians, and yet all the profits from this oil goes overseas, particularly to the BP, British Petroleum. So Mohammad Mossadegh begins to implement reforms. Okay, on the diplomatic front, he feels, hey, since Iran's a sovereign nation, Iran could have friendly relations with whoever it pleases, and opens up diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union, which displeases the West. But what really worked against them was the idea of, hey, the profit from this oil, Iranians should enjoy it. And so he proposed a 50-50 split in oil profits with the British. When the British tell the United States, remember it's the 1950s, sharing the people, make stuff better for the people? No, that's communism. And these diplomatic relations to the Soviet Union to the north? No, that's communism. And remember, these are the Dulles brothers running the CIA. This is the Eisenhower years. What happens is the CIA immediately gets to work in discrediting and creating instability in the government of Mohammad Mossadegh so that he could be removed from power. This is Operation Ajax. We went over this in class. Operation Ajax, actually led by Kermit Roosevelt, the son of former President Theodore Roosevelt. And the CIA basically, paid journalists to plant fake news stories about Mohammad Mossadegh, paid fake labor unions to stage demonstrations against the president. A lot of money was thrown around to get generals to, turn their back on the democratically elected president, to get people to protest against the elected president, accusations that he was a communist, that he was going to bring Iran into the orbit of the Soviet Union. Look at this oil deal. That was nothing more than communism. And eventually, that money persuaded enough people to oust President Mossadegh from power. And that's exactly what happened. And instead of a democracy, absolute power went right back to the Shah. There went their experiment with constitutional monarchy, and Iran returned to being a complete monarchy under Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. This is in short called the Shah of Iran. And that's in 1953. The Iranians never forgot about that. The United States' role in unseating Iran's first democratically elected president. And what they end up with is the autocratic rule of the Shah, supported by the United States and the CIA, held together by the Savak, which was his secret police. In all honesty, though, we try to be as objective here as possible. Iran enjoyed a period of incredible economic growth and prosperity under the Shah. Western-style reforms and et cetera, et cetera. That's the thing about reforms. Like, what could be reformed to one person could be seen as a threat to somebody that thinks very differently. So, fast forward. Yes, Iran Economically, it's booming. But politically, it is a stifled society. There are very few, if any, outlets by which anybody could express any dissent or any criticism about the government. And power is kept in place by the Savak, which was the Shah's secret police. After enough years of this, the Shah loses support of the clergy and of the working class. Iran had a strong communist party because of corruption and the suppression of dissent. In 1978 is when this begins. There's only so many outlets. When you close every possible outlet for potential dissent, whatever outlet you leave open that you did not close, that's where it's going to come from. And in a country like Iran, the only institution society that society would never have tolerated the Shah trying to control would have been the religious institutions, namely the mosque, okay, and run by their clergies and the mullahs. And because even for the Shah, that would have been an incredibly imprudent thing to do. That's exactly where dissent comes from. It comes from the clergy. And a lot of it comes from the underground leftist, communist movement in Iran as well. The same movement that they used to justify the ousting of Mohammad Mosaddegh. There's this weird alliance between the two, but it doesn't last. So eventually, probably the most famous political dissident on the religious side, living in exile, is the Ayatollah Khomeini. He's living in Paris. He has a large following, kind of like a Lenin for Iran. He has a large following in Iran. And when he issues his statements from exile, they're taken very seriously by the clergy in Iran. And starting in 78, they begin to call for strikes and demonstrations against the Shah. So we're going to simplify this. So 78 is a year full of strikes and demonstrations that end up overwhelming the government's ability to maintain order. And what I mean order is maintain the Shah's order. Eventually, these strikes and demonstrations lead to civil resistance, and you end up with, yes, you had armed revolutionaries in a very similar fashion to Nicaragua, trying to incite armed uprisings in the various, urban centers in Iran. It was relatively nonviolent in comparison. The Shah, realizing that he had lost the support of the population, his country, and he's a sick man. He's dying of cancer, by the way. His country, rattled by all these strikes and protests for a good year, decides that it would be best if he left the country and set up a provisional government. And then maybe with a provisional government in place, order could be restored. As soon as the Shah leaves to the United States, and apparently he leaves on January 16th of 1979, the idea is to go get treatment for cancer. The Ayatollah Khomeini returns from Paris after many years of exile. And then that month of February, a gazillion things happen. Okay? Actually, Carter was quite supportive of this new government. The U.S. has a tendency of doing that. Even when a pro-U.S. Government is in place, not necessarily very democratic, once there's enough public opposition, the U.S. is not unheard of to try to find, some moderates to replace this person, and maybe restore order that way. So February is the big month in the Iranian Revolution, when the Shah returns, and then armed groups of revolutionaries actually, start fighting street to street with the army. Okay, the army now in command of the provisional government. But they are losing in one demoralizing defeat after another, in what amounts to a street fighting. The demoralized Iranian army loses one battle after another. So let's focus about the United States because, a lot of it's going to happen just in the first couple of months of 79. The Shah leaves in January 79. The Ayatollah remains. February is the month of rising up against the provisional government. And then in April, they're going to declare the establishment by vote of an Islamic republic, a theocracy. Now, how do we get from there to the Iranian hostage crisis? Um, the Iranian hostage crisis happens towards the tail end of that very turbulent year in which, the revolutionary forces of Iran, which were a weird coalition between communist and religious folks, they begin to consolidate. In February, there's an attempt to take the embassy. Small, but it fails. The U.S. embassy in Tehran now becomes a target of these revolutionaries, representing the resentment and anger that the Iranian government has towards the United States, not just for ousting President Mossadegh in '53, but for supporting the hated Shah of Iran and the Savak and what they saw as a dictatorial government that was basically supported from Washington. And so they blamed the U.S., by extension. November 4th, 1979. And the Ayatollah is already pretty much in place. Already they've been purging, communists from the revolutionary ranks, and it's becoming more and more led by the religious folks. And once again, attention turns to the embassy. This was the second attempt. A demonstration starts to bubble up around the U.S. embassy. People note on the inside, they notice buses of students showing up. You got somewhere between 300-400 students demonstrating outside the embassy. Inside, everybody is alert, okay, because there was an attempt back in February. Well, what do you know? And this was found out later on that the Shah actually supported this. The demonstration outside gets closer and closer to the gates and eventually turns into a siege. Apparently, somebody with bolt cutters cut their way into the damn embassy, and before you know it, students start pouring into the embassy. There's 72 official embassy workers on the grounds at that moment. And as they make their way through that building, they apprehend 66, if I'm not mistaken, of those 72. Okay? So the students grab, apprehend, detain. Why didn't they fire back? Because they thought maybe this will be just like February. Okay? But now they're grabbing and detaining people and making a big deal about it. Now, in the chaos, as the embassy grounds were being stormed, six diplomats made it out of there. Okay? They made it to the Canadian embassy. And eventually later, the Canadian government is going to do this fantastic operation through Canadian intelligence, not the CIA, to smuggle those 6 Americans out of Iran. Ben Affleck made a movie called Argo, and it was more fictitious than real. Made it seem that the United States was behind this operation. It was almost purely a Canadian intelligence operation to smuggle out Americans. So some of the staff escaped. Others made it out into Tehran but were captured. Some of them made it to the UK embassy. Some of them made it to the Swedish embassy. But the 6 that eventually are going to make it out of the country are going to be the ones that made it to the Canadian embassy. But you have 66 taken hostage. The students and their leaders, I guess, the spokesmen that spoke to the press, were claiming that embassy was basically a den of spies, spying on Iran, conspiring against Iran, and that's why that action was justified. They demanded the return of the Shah of Iran, who was in the United States undertaking cancer treatment, for him to be tried and executed in Iranian court. They demanded a U.S. apology for past interference in Iranian affairs, and they demanded a release of $8 billion worth of Iranian assets that were currently frozen in the United States. This hostage situation is going to go on for 444 days. In the course of those 444 days, 14 people are going to be released, namely women, a couple of African Americans, and one individual that suffered from MS. There was a rescue attempt. April 25th, 1980 was called Operation Eagle Claw. The Army's Special Forces Delta Force and 8 helicopters were involved. They were supposed to rendezvous in a desert outside of Tehran and then quickly make a beeline to the embassy to get the embassy staff out and to safety. That mission, one thing went wrong after the other. They basically lost every one of those helicopters, and it was a mission fail. And because that mission failed, and once the Iranians found out, they scattered the hostages throughout the city. So now if there was ever a rescue attempt, there was no way to reach all what was left, 52 of them. And despite negotiations with the Iranian government, the U.S. was never willing to meet the demands of those students. And therefore, the negotiations, the Iranians were claiming that these people were guests, they were being treated well. However, we were claiming that that was not the case, which was true. Testimony from the hostages, they were not being treated well. This really bogged down Carter's presidency. The last year of his presidency is just overwhelmed. I remember when I was a kid in the news, this is day 200, this is day 210, this is day 280. The news every day reminded you what day it was that Americans, 52 Americans, were being held hostage by the Iranians. And then something funny happened. You have the election of 79. Ronald Reagan, with his training as an actor and his charisma, was able to outmaneuver Jimmy Carter, make Jimmy Carter a one-term president. This is conspiracy theory. But wouldn't you know, immediately after Reagan delivered his inaugural address on January 20th, 1981, the Iranians decided without condition to release the remaining 52 hostages, who eventually, for 444 days, were held hostage. There are conspiracy theories that claim, and you could connect the dots if you will, that the Reagan campaign was actually in communication with the Iranians and told them to keep the hostages in place to weaken Carter's chance of winning a second term and guarantee Reagan's. And it may seem far-fetched, but stay tuned, kids. When we go into Reagan's presidency, Iran is going to pop up again in a very interesting way, okay? In that it would not seem improbable that the Reagan people will make a deal with Iran, since it becomes uncovered that they made deals with Iran later. And the rest is history. Our relationship has been a troubled one ever since, and it is not recovered. Iran's position as far as Israel and Israel's right to exist and all that has also added a lot of fuel to this, and that's a conversation for another time. But as far as Jimmy Carter, Iran just like hobbled his presidency. But that's not where it ends. Let's go a little further east. Afghanistan. To understand Afghanistan, well, who in the hell understands it? Afghanistan's a very difficult place to understand. Geographically, Pakistan to the south, well, to its, I guess, east, southeast. What was once the Soviet Union to its northern border. Iran to the west. Unlike Iran, it was more homogeneous. Yes, there are Afghans, but Afghanistan itself separates into various, for lack of a better term, tribal relations. You have Pashtuns and Tajiks, etc., etc. So, having that border with the Soviet Union to the north is going to play a role in this. So, where do we start? Afghanistan in 78, well, there was a monarchy, and in 78 there was actually before, there was a monarchy that was driven out by a Republican government with the intent of modernizing um, Afghanistan. Then that Republican government, within a couple of years, was ousted in a coup in April of 78 by leftist military officers in the Afghan army. And they put in a new government that was, you know, not moderate, but Marxist-Leninist. How you sell Marxism in the Middle East, I've never understood that. Um, but this new government that was installed in April of 78. So this is two coups they have like in the span of like 10 years. And the second coup is the one that installed a new government that was very much aligned with the Soviet Union and its willingness to install in Afghanistan a Marxist-Leninist style government, very pro-Soviet. Um, and as you could imagine, outside of Kabul, which is the capital of Afghanistan, very little public support. Afghanistan from 1979, I'm sorry, 1978, I think through the 1986 or something, I could be wrong with the last year, was 1987, was known as the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. Um, that government's intent was to modernize and bring Afghanistan into the modern world and implement a number of reforms, um, much of it in line with typical goals of revolutionary Marxist governments. And of course, these reforms were going to chafe the very conservative, very religious population, especially the rural population that was not interested in any reforms. This government, highly unpopular outside of Kabul, of course, tried to push through a literacy campaign. Mind you, before the existence of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, illiteracy was 90%. Separation of mosque and state, a pretty new and radical idea in the Middle East at that time. Women's rights, women's suffrage, women's rights to go to school. Women shouldn't have to wear the burqa. Universal education for boys and girls. Land reform. Um, Here's another one that's a little touchy. In Afghanistan, for centuries, if not millennia, they have the cultural tendency of what we in the West would interpret as pedophilia or pedastry, which still exists till today, which is the cultural acceptance of the sexual violation of young men by older men. And this is something that was brought there from Alexander the Great, because the Greeks used to practice pedastry, and one of the places in the world where it's still stuck around with Afghanistan, and it still exists till today, by the way. And the American military turns the other way. I guess we learned that from the Soviets that did not, Okay, that was banned, as were child brides, as were forced marriages. All of these things were banned by the government, the communist government of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. And of course, people didn't like it, and so the government resorted to brutal repression of dissent. So brutal repression of people that were against women's rights, universal education, the banning of child brides, the banning of pedestrian, etc., etc. You were dealing with a very backwards, very conservative, very religious, mostly rural population that were not on the same page with all of these almost Western style modern reforms that were coming out of the government. But that government itself was split between two factions, and the fact that it had internal divisions didn't help. You had your radical faction that was pro-USSR, and then you had your more moderate faction that wanted to approach socialism very slowly, very incrementally, knowing well their population and how their population would react to this. Well, in October of 1979, you have another coup, okay, which basically leads to the purging of that moderate faction and the installation of a pro-Soviet faction. And long story short, um, and this was done with the approval of the Soviet Union. This government, just a couple of months in, they put in a new guy named Karmal. Karmal was basically a uh, a puppet of the Soviet Union, and Karmal realizing that the only way that he could stay in power, because already there was armed resistance to the government. Okay, already in the rural countryside among uh, the various ethnic groups, particularly by the Pashtun, they had taken to the mountains to fight against the government, and what they saw was, a violation of their customs and traditions, and et cetera, et cetera. And the only way the Karmal government could stay in place was outside help. So on December 27th, 1979, um, the Soviet Union crossed the border. Now, here in the West, we called it the Soviet invasion. They called it the Soviet intervention. Where did they justify it from? The Brezhnev Doctrine. The Brezhnev Doctrine said socialist revolutions were irreversible. And an attempt to reverse a socialist revolution would be seen as a direct threat to the Soviet Union. Hence, Soviet tanks rolled into Kabul to support the government of Karmal, who was, the president at the time of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. And that is when the Soviet-Afghan War began. And this event ruffled a lot of feathers in the West. Was it an invasion? Was it an intervention? This is going to prove to be the Soviet Union's Vietnam, if you will. Did they fight their way into Afghanistan? Absolutely not. They were invited in by a government that was not popular among most of the people. And this is the beginning of a long nightmare for the Afghan people, one that still hasn't ended. Okay? It's ironic that we criticize the Soviets for crossing the border and entering into a armed conflict in Afghanistan, and several decades later we're going to do the same thing. And Afghanistan is still Afghanistan. Um, and so what we're going to have here is an armed conflict that's going to be extended over a number of years between Soviet forces in Afghanistan and the holy warriors, the Mujahideen, the men of Afghanistan, the very religious men of Afghanistan who believed that they were fighting a holy jihad against the godless, atheist, um, communist government of Afghanistan and the Soviet Union, which was their sponsors. Here's an interesting picture. The Soviet Big Seven, the seven biggest pieces of hardware that the Soviets brought, and this is just land hardware that the Soviets brought to Afghanistan. A lot can be said about those Mi-24 Hind helicopter gunships. Okay, And I don't know who was more indiscriminate, the United States or the Soviet Union, but apparently the Soviet Union was very indiscriminate in taking the fight to the civilian population. Um, long story short, it's going to be 115,000 Soviet troops supporting 65,000 troops of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan against a quarter million, so they were outnumbered, mujahideen of the various ethnic and tribal groups of Afghanistan. By the time Reagan becomes president, um, Reagan's going to make a choice to support the mujahideen. They're going to receive CIA training. In 1986, they're going to get 250 Stinger missile launchers and thousands of these missiles. Um, and the Soviets are going to lose this war. Okay, they're going to lose 333 Hind helicopter gunships, 451 aircraft, 147 T-72 tanks, um, and about 2 million civilians are going to die in this conflict. And I wish I could tell you when the Soviets pull out and this conflict comes to an end that, you know, there's going to be peace in Afghanistan. There's not going to be peace in Afghanistan. And then they're going to spend the next 10 years fighting a civil war. And then the Americans are going to come. And these people haven't known peace. They have not known peace for almost half a century. Okay? And when we talk about the CIA and unintended consequences, like for example, the Iranian Revolution was the anti-American turn of the Iranian Revolution was unexpected consequence of what? Of Operation Ajax. They call this blowback. The CIA goes and does something, and then there's an unintended consequence after the fact. It's called blowback. And these mujahideen came from all over the Muslim world, convinced that, the greatest of their enemies were the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union were not big fans of religion. Therefore, they were a threat to Islam. And so they've attracted, these Muslim holy warriors, these jihadists. Folks, we are living the consequences of this blowback, even till today. Let me just show you a picture to surprise you. Well, not yet. Shouldn't have done that. Bad timing. By the way, the United States decided, and Western allies decided to express their disappointment, their disagreement, whether you want to call it invasion or call it intervention. That year, the Summer Olympics were going to be held at Moscow. And that year, I guess dashing the hopes of many athletes, the United States decided to boycott the 1980 Olympics. And the United States did not attend the 1980 Olympics, nor did several Western governments. So guess where all the gold medals went to, since we weren't there. But then again, during the Cold War, the Olympics were always between, most of the medals were always between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union took great pride pouring a ton of effort into its sports programs. If socialist countries have something, they really take seriously, and they pour a ton of resources into their athletes and their sports programs because they were propaganda opportunities. The Nazis tried it in 33 and failed miserably, but the Soviets and allied countries of the Soviets took this to an art form to demonstrate the superiority of the socialist system through sport. And if you use sport as a measure, wow, I mean, other than the United States, they were racking up. Look at Cuba. I mean, for its size per capita, I don't think any country has ever racked up as many gold medals in the Olympics, the medals in general, than Cuba has, for a country of 14 million people. Now, so yeah, this was the picture I was going to show you. Yeah, you know him, Osama bin Laden, son of one of the many sons of one of the wealthiest people in Saudi Arabia. The Bin Laden Company still exists. It's a major construction firm. He was not born in Saudi Arabia. He was born in Yemen, believe it or not. But early on in his career, and this is a well-traveled guy. He was, a rich kid. His father was a multi-billionaire. Trips to Europe, a European education. I even think he took trips to the United States. Um, and he went and he fought in Afghanistan during the Soviet-Afghan War as a CIA trained mujahideen, and much what he was taught, it came back. It came back. There's a subject for later. So let's close out this presentation, bringing it back closer to home. So you know how Iran hobbled Carter's presidency. You know how Afghanistan, hobbled, Carter's presidency. And then we return to the topic of Cuba. And maybe at home, you guys know a little bit about this. The story of the Cuban exile community is a story that's happened in waves. Okay? If you remember, in 1959, Fidel takes power. The first waves of people that leave Cuba, 59, 60, these are people that are intimately connected to the Batista dictatorship, people in the military, the very, very wealthy. These are the first ones that leave. They're leaving on planes. They already have bank accounts here. They have homes, etc., etc. Very, very few are of a class lower than, who was the economic, political elite of Cuba at that time. Then you have, in the early 60s, the Catholic Church is able to get Cuba to concede to flying kids of Catholic families out of Cuba. These are the Peter Pan flights, saying that, the government's going to turn your kids into, loyal communists, and we want them to be Catholics, so get them out of there. And then the freedom flights, quite often the parents of these children. And then in 65, you had Camarioca, which was a significant boat lift that the Cuban government says, fine, leave the ones that don't really want to be here. That's like 5,000 of them. These are successive waves. What you have to understand, and this may ruffle some feathers, when you get to about, you could break down the history of revolution in two parts. The Cuban Revolution while the Soviet Union existed, and the Cuban Revolution after the fall of the Soviet Union. It's almost two completely different places. Before the Soviet Union fell, okay, the economic situation in Cuba was not what it's been since the 1990s. Cuba was heavily, heavily, heavily subsidized by the Soviet Union, particularly through oil. Gifts of oil to Cuba, the oil, and not only that, but then again, you're talking about the Soviet Union, not the wealthiest country in the world. A lot of military hardware. Cuba was armed to the teeth. Cuba had a very active and ambitious foreign policy that stretched throughout Latin America and into Africa. Basic needs were met. This is a period that many Cubans that lived there at that point called it the golden age of socialism. Okay, people were getting mokovichis and ladas. People were staying at the Havana Hilton or in a hotel on the beach, usually for performing well at work. It was not the same. What there was political repression. It was not an economic situation. And the people leaving Cuba up to that point were leaving for political reasons. It's when the Soviet Union falls apart, okay, and the Cuban economy takes a nosedive. There went all those subsidies, okay. That's when the second half starts, when it becomes economic, and people start leaving Cuba not because of the political situation, not because of the ideological situation, but because it's economically more and more difficult to live there. Okay? But there's two stages. It's during the Soviet Union and after the Soviet Union. You could argue it's very different places. During the Soviet Union, as far as the Latin American country is concerned, because Cuba is not the United States, and to compare Cuba to the United States, I think it's very unfair. Within reason of a Latin American country, there was plenty. Okay, it's after the fall. So okay, so if we're talking about 1980, we're talking about that period that Cuba's enjoying generous subsidies from the Soviet Union. Generous. So what drives this is for the most part political, most part ideological, not economic like we're going to see in the 90s and so on. And it starts on April 1st. If you understand Havana, there's one street. Um, Once you leave the older part of the city of Malecon and you cross a bridge that crosses El Almendare, La Quinta. And La Quinta is a street, kind of used to be fancy back in the old days. That's where all the embassies are. Okay. You take La Quinta, get to Marianao, if anybody knows. A bus driver already with four other people on the bus, had made plans that and I'm wondering to what extent, what happened in Iran with the embassy in February played a role in this. The bus driver decides to use the bus as a battering ram to get himself inside the Peruvian embassy. And sure enough, that's what he does. And he takes his bus and he rams it through the fencing, the gate of the Peruvian embassy. Shots are fired because there's Cuban security personnel. Like in all countries, Cuban security quite often is the embassy, and there's also embassy security. And one of the embassy guards one of the security are killed. 3 days later, Cuba demands, and then they ask for asylum inside because you sign an embassy, you're inside that country. Um, the 5 Cubans that rammed their way into the embassy asked for asylum from the Peruvian government. Um, 2 days later, the Cuban government demands that Peru release those 5 so they could be tried and held responsible for the death of that one guard. Um, and Peru says no. And that act alone, when Peru tells Cuba, no, we're not going to release these 5, word spreads really fast in Cuba. And word gets around that, hey, the first 5 people that got into the Peruvian embassy and the Peruvians are not going to turn them in to Fidel. Within 2 days, you got 10,000 people pouring into that embassy, asking for asylum from the Peruvian government. And now the Cuban government has a situation that doesn't know how to handle it. Because it thought everybody was happy. The last time they got rid of, troublemakers was in 65. I mean, so what do? Well, one of the things to draw negative attention to this, the Cuban government begins to organize actos de repudio, basically rallies around the embassy, anti-American rallies, and then of course, using the language of the revolution, calling the people inside the embassy traitors and worms, and throwing eggs at them, etc., etc. Um, the U.S., Peru and Cuba start to talk. Um, how many people would Peru take? Peru was not going to take all 10,000. Whether other countries would be willing to take? Would Cuba be willing to take? I mean, not Cuba. Would the United States be willing to take some of the people in that embassy? And of course, the embassy's surrounded. There's not going to be any more. We're going to stop the flow. To get people out of the embassy, the Cuban government, and I know people that went through this, um, to the 10,000 in the embassy grounds, starts to hand out, safe passage and immigration paperwork. Instead of here, okay, fine, you want to leave. Go home and prepare these immigration papers, and we're going to let you leave. And they did. And in that time being, those 2 weeks that those people went back home to prepare their immigration papers, they were allowed to go back with the authorities. People were paraded in front of their house. Eggs were thrown at them. They lost their jobs. I had one friend that was stood in front of the classroom and the teacher berated him and his family. took off his pionero neckerchief from around his neck. The children were encouraged to belittle this child because of his parents' choice. So they went through a tough 2 weeks. And then on the 11th of April, I'm not the 11th, on the 20th of April, Fidel basically says on TV, if you want to leave, leave. Go to Mariel, which is a port city that's not very far from Havana. Just like in Camarillo, if you want to leave, leave. Um, if family are coming to bring to get you, they're the ones that are responsible for it. They'll bring a ship, they'll get you, and you'll leave. And so just like that, and it's going to play out over the next several months, I believe, 125,000 Cubans are going to leave Cuba. When Mariel, or, and to Fidel, it's like, well, this is the way I get rid of potential trouble. This is how I get rid of the opposition. Because you think about it, he told those 125,000 unhappy Cubans to leave Cuba. Those are 125,000 Cubans he doesn't have to worry about anymore. But wait a minute, it becomes more interesting. As those families made their way to Mariel under the watchful eye of Cuban security, and they made their way to the port, and literally hundreds of ships came from the United States to pick them up. For the most part, Cubans picking up their families. Wait. You just can't leave because like that. And apparently valuables were taken from them. Jewelry. So no, you can't take that because, the thing they like to say in Cuba is that's patrimonio nacional, that belongs to the country. So hand over your jewelry, this and that, antiques. Oh, and wait a minute. For this boat to leave, you got to take some extra people. And Fidel used this opportunity to empty out the jails and the insane asylums. So every boat that showed up in Madrid to pick up a number of Cubans, in order to disembark, also had to agree to take a number on board that the Cuban government was telling them had to go on board. These were common criminals, murderers, rapists, etc., etc. These were people held in the various insane asylums in Cuba because mental health is universal. And Cuba also uses opportunity to expel a good part of its LGBTQ community, um, particularly trans individuals in Cuba, were also put on these boats and sent to the United States. So that's the underlying layer that a lot of people don't know about. So this was Los Marielitos, and I remember this as a kid, as they made their way here to the United States. And of course Carter decides to take 30,000, that 30,000 balloons to over 125,000. And Carter's made to seem weak for opening up his doors more than anybody else did. Um, because you let Fidel flush his toilet, on top of the heads of the United States. That was the argument. And the Cubans that were already here um, did not treat this wave very nice. I mean, there's a long, awful tradition that the most recent wave is always treated like horribly by older waves, okay, who somehow feel, for one reason or another, superior. And the Marielitos, as they were called when they came to Miami, other Cubans refer to them as escoria. That's trash that comes from the ocean. This is significant because the people that were leaving before 1980, these were the privileged of Cuba. These were the economic, social, political ruling class. This was the well-to-do middle class, still for the most part overwhelmingly white. Mariel breaks that pattern. Mariel is the Cuban working class. It's supposed to be the backbone of the revolution. They're starting to abandon the revolution. And it's not about economics. It's not about economics. It's about politics. It's about ideology. It's about living, in a politically stifling, suffocating situation and repressive. Okay. Um, and then Carter gets saddled with, again, weak leader, weak president. How come you didn't stand up to Fidel? And then the United States, particularly Miami, has a couple of tough years. The crime rate goes up because honestly, a couple of more than a couple, a significant number of common criminals made it here. And here's an interesting side note. At the same time that the United States opened its arms to the Maria boat lift, it decided to close its arms to Haitians. Haitians were coming to Miami in boats, much longer distance, but to the United States, to South Florida, and they were being turned back. And the argument was, oh no, 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 but the Cubans are political refugees, and the Haitians are not. The Haitians are economic refugees. But the argument was, no, no, no. The Haitians were also running from a dictatorship, from the Duvalier dictatorship. The difference was Duvalier was a pro-U.S. dictator, whereas Fidel was not. Eventually, by the end of 80, they made an exception and allowed a significant number of Haitians to come by boat and not be sent back to Haiti. So, folks, not a lot of slides, but a lot to say. Okay, if we take the first PowerPoint and the second one, you could see, what would you have done? Why Carter's presidency was just plagued by very difficult foreign policy challenges. Like, how in the world are you supposed to resolve this? And Carter tried to ease, tensions with Cuba, but then this happened and it set the clock back. So that's it for today. There'll be a short quiz, and we'll see each other next time.